2004 was the best year video games will ever have. I'm serious, you may have your favourite year in games, maybe a game you really love came out then, or it was just a year you discovered a bunch of really good titles. But you're wrong, it's 2004. Why 2004? Well, a staggering number of, quite honestly, industry-defining titles came out that year. And right now, you either don't believe it's that many, or you already know this, and you're telling me so smugly in the comments.
Yeah man, we already know that. Can you just go back to making Ratchet & Clank videos?
Man, I released 2 videos in a row. Could you shut the I mean, you're right. The fact that a surprisingly high number of excellent video games released in 2004 is not a new revelation, but I doubt you know just how extensive that list is. Starting in January, we have Fire Red and Leaf Green, the first Pokemon remakes. I'm not actually sure what the consensus on these games is. I might be biased towards this generation of Pokemon, but they're still good games, right? It's not just me. Anyway, the next game most certainly is good. It's more than good. It's the best visual novel to ever be developed. Ace Attorney Trials and Tribulations. No, not this Trials and Tribulations, that was released in 2007, but the very first version for the Game Boy Advance. So less Trials and Tribulations and more Gyakuten Saiban 3. It's actually rather fascinating playing this version of the game if you can manage to track down the fan English translation, although I will say that the DS releases are by far the superior versions, if just for the non-bit crushed music alone.
Okay, well you haven't really played any other visual novel series, so you can't really say it's the best.
Objection!
You're wrong. Okay, you're correct, I haven't played any other visual novel series, but this is the best one, and I will not hear otherwise. We also can't forget about Metroid Zero Mission, a fantastic remake of Metroid 1, which... Okay, it does have issues, but it's a trillion times more playable than the game it remakes, so we can give it a pass. I mean, if you think it's too structured, just go do reverse boss order, see if that changes your mind. We're just gonna skip the next 3 months because nothing really happens. I mean, unless you count Sonic Heroes, which, let's just move on to the middle of the year, which is also fairly light, although it does heat up later on. In June, we had Four Swords, an interesting 2D Zelda for the GameCube, and an absolute classic, Spider-Man 2. Jokes aside, it might seem like, and to be fair probably was, a fairly cheap licensed movie tie-in game, but its web-swinging mechanics were surprisingly robust, to the point where they're still being compared to new releases to this very day. August is also quite light, with Doom 3, which, while not being as highly regarded as Dooms 1 and 2, is apparently a decent game in its own right, and, also in true id Software fashion, pioneered a bunch of new technology with id Tech 4. We also have Pikmin 2, which is a game. Look, I have next to no knowledge on Pikmin, but they seem to be a well-regarded set of games, so they're probably important enough to list. Okay, here's where it really starts to get interesting. In September, we've got Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green.
Hold up, I thought those released in January.
Well, you're right, they did, in Japan. The West had to wait a fair few more months before they got their hands on these games, but the real reason I'm mentioning Pokemon again is for the other game that released in September, Pokemon Emerald. I might be a little biased, it being my first Pokemon game and all, but it's still good. I think. Rayquaza is cool, or whatever. Okay, let's get serious. It's time for Sly 2. Now, I cannot personally vouch for its quality, I'm still yet to tackle that series. Maybe I'll stream it or something, I don't know. But by all accounts, it might be the best game to come out from the PS2's big 3 platformers. Speaking of PlayStation platformers, Crash Twinsanity also released in September, which... Look, I'm aware it's a game from Crash's Forgotten era, but it's at the very least interesting, which really can't be said for the other games released between Warped and 4. September was also apparently the month of Star Wars, with the release of the original Star Wars Battlefront. Now, most people know that series for its sequel, but we can't really forget about the original, can we? There was also another Star Wars game in September, which... Look, I'm gonna be honest, it's not really that important. It's Star Wars Trilogy Apprentice of the Force for the Game Boy Advance, another extremely middling licensed movie tie-in game. The reason I bring it up is because I have a fair amount of sentimental value to it. It was one of the only games we had for our Game Boy Advance, which I guess wasn't really even a GBA, it was a Game Boy Micro, and it was the best game we had for the thing, which should tell you a lot about the quality of our GBA game collection. Moving away from nostalgia, and before we get into what I really want to talk about, we have 2 excellent releases in October, with Paper Mario and GTA San Andreas. Very different games, but both well regarded in their own right. Okay, it might have seemed a little lackluster up until now. I mean, sure, these are some good games, but their volume is not exactly groundbreaking. If you know how game releases are traditionally scheduled, you might already know why, but to those that don't, shit's about to get real. Because just in the month of November, we have Halo 2, MGS3, Ratchet & Clank Up Your Arsenal, Jak 3, Metroid Prime 2, and Half-Life 2 CS Source and Gary's Mod. Let's start at the top of that list first. Halo 2 was revolutionary, even more so than Halo Combat Evolved, because Halo 2 introduced what is now the current state of multiplayer gaming, online multiplayer. Xbox Live exists now because of this game. It's what made it mainstream, and it was the first game to have both online and split-screen multiplayer that functioned together. Except, that's not actually true. Ratchet & Clank Up Your Arsenal beat it by a week, releasing just days before Halo 2 and therefore beating it to the market for the title of the first game with joint split-screen and online multiplayer. Of course, it wasn't nearly as successful as Halo 2, so history will remember that as the game to introduce online multiplayer, which, let's be real, it did. But Ouya is still an excellent game in its own right, and Insomniac's highest rated game, to this day. Not to be outdone, Naughty Dog also released the third game in their PS2 trilogy this month, Jak 3. It wasn't as critically acclaimed as Ouya or Halo, but it was still a game in the Jak trilogy, which should give you some measure of its quality. Speaking of releases and critically acclaimed franchises, Metroid Prime 2 also came out this month. A game I've actually played, so I can speak on its quality. Is real good. I rate it above Prime 1, although that opinion could probably get me shot in some corners of the internet, but it is definitely an excellent game, no matter how you slice it. Before we get to the big games suffixed by 2, some smaller games. Well, a smaller game, and Metal Gear Solid 3. Do I really need to say more about MGS3? No. Good, because I haven't actually played it, but by all accounts it's fantastic, a relic from a time where Kojima, made video games.
You haven't played any games made by Kojima, you have no grounds to make that argument.
Fair. The small one is Legend of Zelda Minish Cap, by the way, a game that didn't exactly light the world on fire, but it's still a really fun Zelda game, with interesting ideas born from being developed outside of Nintendo for once. Okay, that's enough stalling. Now we talk about Source. First, Half-Life 2. I mean, for fuck's sakes, it's Half-Life 2. Has there ever been a more revolutionary title? You could make an argument for the original Half-Life, but I mean still, Half-Life 2 is possibly one of the best first-person shooters ever made, and not only that, its engine would drive most of the game development done outside of the industry, and some inside the industry for many, many years. Case in point, Gary's Mod. Again, do we really need to speak about Gmod? You know just how much impact that game had, so let's not dwell on it for long. And then to end the year, Star Wars graces us again with KOTOR 2.
So a bunch of video games released in 2004. What's the big deal?
Well, did you notice anything odd that links all of those titles?
I mean, yeah, we are, reading off the same script.
Well, why'd you ask what the point was if you already knew?
To act as a transition in the script, so the two sections link.
Okay, can I get on with it then?
Fine, I can read stage directions too, man. Ugh, those are the thanks I get, fucking cunt.
Isn't it kind of odd that most of these games are sequels? I mean, sequels in the more traditional sense, ignoring all the long-running franchises, so most of the things developed and or published by Nintendo, and you get a lot of games that are suffixed by either 2 or 3. Halo 2, Pikmin 2, Metroid Prime 2, Half-Life 2, Sly 2, Ratchet 3, Jak 3, MGS 3, Doom 3, Gyaku and Cyber 3, it's strange, isn't it? Well, not really. Games are known for usually having pretty excellent sequels, in contrast to other types of media. Iterative design lends itself extremely well to software, so sequels tend to, generally, be better than their predecessors. Except, can we really say that's true anymore? More than that, do direct, iterative sequels really happen anymore? How many games in recent years have released with some kind of number suffix, either inferred or literal? Sure, there are a number of examples, but they're more often than not attempting to redefine whatever series they came from. That's not a bad thing, mind you, it's more just reflective that, well, the industry has changed. Games like these aren't developed anymore. This was the early years of refining IP, and we aren't in them anymore. We've long since moved away from the days where studios would be constantly developing new IPs. With lengthened production scopes and budgets, not to mention lengthened timeframes, means a much greater degree of risk for these AAA studios. You can't just release another game a year, 2 years after you just finished the last one, to implement all of the lessons you've learned with an iterative design. I mean, there is an argument to say that they couldn't either. Many of these games are famous for their untenable production schedules, but that's a topic for another video. By the time you finish production on a sequel to a game now, it's been so long that a game in the style of a direct, iterative sequel is gonna feel strange, as even the industry will have moved on. It's the more rapid development cycles of the early 2000s that led to this anomaly of a year, as well as the industry hitting the point of refinement of 3D game development. They were well past the experimentation of the late 90s by this point. This isn't going to happen again, and in some ways we probably shouldn't want it to. Again, some of these development schedules were brutal to their developers. But nonetheless, 2004's release schedule, the solidification of game design that it represents, it's an extremely interesting artifact of the history of the game development industry.
Dude, you were like 3 years old in 2004. You have no idea what the fuck you're talking about, do you?
Nope. The solidification of game design that it represents, it's an extremely interesting artifact of the history of the game development industry. Again, you're using my fucking data. Stop it. Stop. You are thousands of meters away from me. Maybe not thousands, maybe only hundreds. And yet, you can still consume gigabytes and gigabytes of my server. Fuck you.
You haven't played any games made by Kojima. You have no grounds to make that argument.